about Reg BI and the future of compliant investment recommendations. A few quick housekeeping matters before we get started. We are recording today's conversation and plan to share it with you following today's session. We welcome your engagement and questions, so please use the chat box that's available at the bottom of your Zoom interface to submit any questions you may have for our panelists. We have a lot of time near the end of today's session to address your questions. There's the chat box. As with many of you, we are all working from home. So from time to time, you may hear some background noise. We sincerely appreciate your understanding. We've also planned a special offer for today's attendees, which we'll share with you at the end of today's presentation, so stay tuned. And following today's webinar, we will be sending out a short survey to hear your feedback. And in the spirit of doing our part, we will be donating $25 for every survey response to the Direct Relief Charity. We're excited to have a stellar lineup of guests today. I will ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Matt?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending here today. My name is Matt Rogowski, and I head Advisor Solutions for Morningstar. And really in that role, my job is to pay attention to the key trends in the advisory wealth management space, including the evolving regulatory landscape, of course. And then, with that knowledge, you'll work with our product and sales team to develop and deliver those solutions out into the marketplace.
Pete?
Good afternoon. I'm Peter Tepley. I'm a litigation partner at RumbergerKirk up in Caldwell. For the last 19 years, I've practiced a lot in FINRA arbitrations in customer member, customer associated person disputes on both sides, but primarily defending broker-dealers and their associated persons. And I've also helped with the regulatory inquiries that get generated by those customer complaints at FINRA. Good to be with you.
Thanks, Pete. David?
Thanks, Parm. We're delighted to be hosting such a great group of wealth leaders today. My name is David Reeve, and I'm the CEO of InvestorCOM. Over the course of the last 25 years, I've worked with leading global wealth managers, helping them solve their compliance challenges with technology.
Thanks, David. And my name is Parm Nasseri, VP of Regulatory Strategy at InvestorCOM. I'll be moderating today's conversation. So let's get things started. If you've been following InvestorCOM's webinar series, you'd know that so far we've covered broad themes such as illustrating good faith compliance and what are some best practices for ensuring compliance in a remote work environment. Today, we're zooming in on the regulatory implications of Reg BI and the care obligation on broker-dealers and associated persons. We'll also explore options for demonstrating the care obligation and reasonably available alternatives when making investment recommendations. We'll also discuss best practices around disclosure and record-keeping elements of investment recommendations, especially in a remote work capacity. Lastly, for folks who are sending us questions, we've allotted 10 to 15 minutes available to take up your questions and answer any that come up. So we now know that we are only a few days away from the June 30th deadline. And today we want to focus on the care obligation pillar of Reg BI. As part of this pillar, broker-dealers will need to exercise reasonable diligence, care, and skill when making investment recommendations. I'm going to turn it to Pete. Can you talk to us a bit about the care obligation at a 10,000-foot level? What should firms be aware of?
Sure. So a couple things, and I hope folks can hear me. I heard I was a little low earlier, so I'm going to talk a little louder. But one of the things is you got to understand the potential risk, rewards, and cost associated with a recommendation and have a reasonable basis to believe that that recommendation could be in the best interest of at least some retail customers. And then looking at a particular retail customer, You need to see if it is in the client's best interest based on that customer's investment profile. And by looking at the potential risk, rewards, and associated costs, and make sure that the recommendation does not put the broker-dealer's interests ahead of the customer's interests. And the third thing is to have a reasonable basis to believe that a series of recommended transactions is not excessive and is in the customer's best interest. Now, some of that sounds pretty familiar, but there's three things I think that exceed current suitability requirements. And they are: one, that the recommendation be in the best interest of the retail customer and not place the broker-dealer's interest ahead of the customer's interest. Two is that the cost of the recommendation must be considered when making a recommendation. And three is that the broker-dealer or the associated person, as part of having a reasonable basis to believe that a recommendation is a customer's best interest, they must consider reasonably available alternatives. And so those costs, the reasonably available alternatives, and not putting the broker-dealer's interest ahead of the retail customer are new things that should be focused on.
Thanks, Pete. That's really helpful. Let me ask you a question related to experience. So you've done a lot of work in the disputes and litigation space, as you highlighted earlier. How can firms ensure that they are taking steps to mitigate these risks as it relates to the care obligation you just mentioned?
Sure. So one thing, and it's always been true, but good contemporaneous documentation of what was done. So without documentation, these disputes often occurs years after the fact, and people's memories are faded. And so it's important, because the best interest obligation is looked at the time it's made, to reflect what was looked at. What costs were considered, what reasonably available alternatives were considered, how was the determination made that it was in the customer's best interest. All of that, if it's documented contemporaneously when the analysis is done, will go a long way. I've heard regulators say, and I'm sure many of you have, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. The other thing I found is that customer cases are often seen by the panels as the customer says, the associated person, the firm says. And so you have two contrasting stories about what was said. Panels are very swayed, in my opinion, by good contemporaneous documentation. If there's good contemporaneous documentation of what was said, that goes a long way. If there's not, that can also be a problem. So documentation will certainly help mitigate the risks.
Thanks, Pete. I think that's a tweetable moment. If there's no documentation, it didn't happen. Matt, let me turn it over to you. Given your experience, how do you believe the industry and the average broker-dealer will need to adapt to the specifics of the Reg BI rules and the care obligation?
I do think it'll actually change the behaviors within the firms for sure. And I think what you'll see is that, most representatives, right, most advisors, have a process. And I think Pete points out that documentation does become critical. But I would also say that within the firm, I think we will migrate a bit from many processes that were perhaps voluntary, I'll say, to much more, compulsory activities in terms of making sure that there's a disciplined process that's laid out, but taking steps to ensure that that process is followed consistency, right? So leveraging, again, the expertise that the representatives within the firm have to evaluate investments, on their merits of performance, risk, and cost. But I think more importantly, the firms are going to have to step in and say, okay, we recognize and understand that you have this expertise and capability. However, there are some things we're going to have to require of you to make certain that that process is followed when and if it is necessary, given the regulation and the outcomes that are driven by that process are again in line. And so I do think you'll see again a shift from what might have been voluntary in the past to definitely activities around investment analysis, investment selection that are much more compulsory in nature. And that really drives a lot of the conversation just around striking the right balance between keeping that representative flexibility, right, to manage their practice and their client base as they see fit, with that need for home office, I'll say, control or process definition to make sure that the appropriate risks are mitigated and in the regulation is followed.
That's interesting, Matt. In your conversations with broker dealers and firms who are trying to adhere with the Reg BI rules, what are you hearing? Are they ready to be compliant come June 30th?
I would say this. I mean, we have seen, since January, where there was clarification that look, it's not going to be extended, the deadline. We have seen an absolute flurry of activity, and I would say, in terms of readiness, I think from a documentation perspective, so delivery of things like Form CRS and other document and disclosures that are required. I think firms are feeling good about it. However, many are adopting what I would describe as very manual processes, paper-based processes to kind of handle that initial delivery. I think they've gone then and moved into really trying to deconstruct the care obligation and identify the various requirements that are going to be defined or required. And so I think, from a documentation perspective, I think phase one, they're feeling good. However, they'll want to look to automate and use technology further on down the line to create efficiencies there. I think from a care obligation perspective, I think processes have been outlined, strawman's developed, documentation training have begun around the elements of the care obligation that will be required. However, we are seeing a lot of phasing in terms of the technologies. And so we are expecting that our activities in terms of technology selection, technology deployment, and implementation to move well beyond June 30th, into the fall and winter as well, in kind of a continued evolution, of technology-based solutions and workflows. And so, a lot of great work being done. I would clearly say, though, the work within the firms is going to extend well beyond, that June 30 deadline that's approaching here next week.
Thanks for sharing that, Matt. Pete, let's talk a little bit about consequences of inaction here. What would be the outcome if a firm is non-compliant after June 30th?
Well, I think the initial consequence could be regulatory risks. If the regulators start looking at, okay, how are you and analyzing costs, and start looking, if you're not analyzing the costs, then why aren't you? How are you determining what reasonably available alternatives need to be considered? What's your process for determining what your interests are as opposed to the retail customers, and how are you making sure that you're not putting that interest ahead of the retail customers? Later on, I think there's litigation risks, right? The same process, like now or prior to June 30th, if you were to determine an investment was suitable or argue it was to a panel, how do you show that? In the same way going forward, how do you show it was in the client's best interest, right? How do you show that what cost you considered? Again, what reasonably available alternatives you considered? All of those things, there's a risk if that stuff is not in place of litigation. That probably occurs later. It may occur sooner than later if the markets go down, because customer complaints sort of follow the market, in my experience. If the market's up, there's less of them. If the markets go down and people are lost money on investments, then they're looking for someone to help make them whole, and they're going to come to the firm and possibly the associated person to try to make them pay if they don't comply with their obligations. And so I think the best interest obligation goes in June 30th, and though you may not have litigation risk immediately, it will come up down the road, and it's better to start mitigating it from the beginning so you have the required documents and processes in place.
Thanks, Pete. Now, Matt, in your view, how does the regulation best interest and specifically the care obligation strengthen the standards of conduct for broker-dealers?
You know, I think if we kind of take a look at, what was suitability versus, advisory fiduciary to, best interest, versus fiduciary advisory, I think that gap has closed, right? And so we've migrated from, a suitability description, which says, we must believe that investment is suitable for the investor, and we must attempt to gather information about their facts and circumstances, to align with that recommendation. So we move from that construct to, the words that surround Reg BI and the care obligation in terms of, you must gather that relevant information about the investor's profile, right? You must include cost, and evaluate that investment relative to reasonably available alternatives. You must eliminate or disclose and mitigate those conflicts. So I do think it certainly strengthens, right, the integrity of the investor protection that is really all about Reg BI here. If we think about it, though, I think, as you see the slide here, I do think one important thing to note, right, before we kind of step into what the solutions might look like, is in fact, the idea that it is a principles-based regulation, right? So unlike the first iteration, which was the DOL fiduciary rule, which was, I'll say, extremely prescriptive, this is more principles-based, right? So you will see and hear different solutions being deployed across firms. Some are simply providing information and data to their advisors, helping them perform their own analysis and determining what is reasonable. On the other end of the spectrum, right, in terms of reduced flexibility for the advisor, and I'll say maximum risk mitigation at the firm level, you're seeing more push towards the full advisory program with things like managed portfolios, where again co-fiduciary relationships, reducing the investment selection and recommendation responsibilities of the advisor. I'd say most end up in the middle here, where they're offering additional insights and guidance, kind of curating data and information, helping to curate those recommendations and provide that research and guidance. That's where we're seeing most of the firms end up in terms of this spectrum of solution offerings to address the need.
So, Matt, looking at the care obligation and the consideration for reasonably available alternatives, what kind of due diligence do you believe will be necessary on a go-forward basis?
Yeah, so in terms of workflows that we feel are relevant, and this may actually address some of the question around, okay, what do we need to document, right? So we think there's a few key workflows that are required under the care obligation. The first has to do with investment recommendations, and so this is when a mutual fund or ETF or investment product is being recommended to the individual. In terms of that workflow, the representative must document that they've screened the product shelf, so the available product offerings within the firm. They've identified reasonably available alternatives that are alike the investment recommendation, and then they need to compare those on the performance of that investment relative to those alternatives, the fees that are assessed. Obviously, cost is explicitly pointed out in the regulation, as well as the performance and risk, right? So how does that perform relative to its peers? And so that's workflow number one, and I'll dig into that a little bit deeper in a moment here, but obviously they must document that process, but then generate output. So reports that actually show, right, that it was compared to an alternative, what those data elements were that were considered, and then archived for future use. The second workflow would be elevating that to the strategy or portfolio level. So recognizing the investor's profile and then making certain that the group of investments in a portfolio or strategy align with that investor's profile, and again, are aligned with their interests. And then finally, there's workflows that we're exploring with our partner clients around specialty cases. So rolling over from a defined contribution plan into an IRA program, and that's where you need to document the costs associated with the defined contribution plan relative to the costs and fees associated with the IRA, along with other ancillary services like planning and or behavioral coaching and other elements of those programs. That's one workflow I'd say in the specialty use case. And then the final is annuity recommendations, and we're certainly seeing a lot of activity at the state level in terms of mimicking or adopting similar best interests around annuity recommendations. But again, making certain that the characteristics of those products in terms of the guaranteed income and other features, along with the underlying investment products, align with the objectives of that individual. If we roll forward just one slide there, Parm, as well, we can in terms of the actual the things we want to consider, right, when we're looking at the at those reasonably available alternatives, we surface things like performance risk and performance risk and cost relative to peers within a category. So that's kind of how we start to filter down the list. And so things like looking at fees lower than the product that's being recommended within the same category, are things like risk associated relative to peers in the category, are all things we think are very important when making that assessment of reasonably available alternatives.
Thanks, Matt. A quick reminder for folks who are tuned in, please, you can use the chat interface to submit any questions you may have, and we have a lot of time at the end of today's session to take up your questions. Okay, David, in your respective view, what role does technology play in demonstrating reasonably available alternatives?
Thanks, Parm. I think it's helpful to kind of look at the 4 obligations of Reg BI and then kind of think about them all on a spectrum. I think a spectrum's useful where technology is on one end, human processes on the other. Human processes and training, or we'll call one group. And of course, nothing's purely process, and nothing's purely technology. However, I think each obligation falls in a slightly different place on the spectrum. For example, if you start on the right, the compliance obligation is virtually entirely about process definition. It's all about establishing and maintaining policies and controls within your dealer. The conflict of interest obligation, as you move to the left, is primarily process. Really what you're doing here is identifying, eliminating conflicts of interest within your organization. And there's no question that technology can aid in record keeping around, tracking advisor compliance. But again, primarily, the balance there would be on the process and training side. As you move to disclosure, I think we all know this, that you really need to rely heavily on technology. I mean, it's one thing to send a disclosure document. It's another thing to record keep and track it over time and, keep track of versions of Form CRS, et cetera. So, I think to have a proper books and records system to track all disclosure events, whether you're delivering Form CRS ADV or really any disclosure document, you'll need to rely on technology. And I think most of our clients are certainly looking seriously at this. Finally, back to the care obligation piece that Pete and Matt have been talking about, in our view, it's virtually impossible to really meet this obligation without technology. Any dealer with a complex product shelf, and we're seeing a lot of dealers that have north of 20,000 products on their shelf. So, anything of that, kind of volume requires significant monitoring or tracking reasonably available alternatives, will be very difficult to be successful by leveraging just process and training alone. So they will require, some level of technology support. And we can look at just a super quick example here. If an advisor is making a recommendation, in this particular case, a nationwide fund is being recommended, and this product shelf, it's a bit of a small slide here, but there's over 25,000 products, and it's identified 158 peers within this product shelf. So we're kind of sharing a brief screenshot of the InvestorCOM and Morningstar apps, which both provide this kind of capability. And this example shows that the nationwide fund is lower than the median of its 158 peers on cost, risk, and return. So, really using a platform like this, I would say tech for reasonably available alternatives And, there are several technology solutions. Both of these are powered by Morningstar and, provide different solutions depending on the specific needs. But let's just look at one very, very quick example here of why technology is required for the care obligation. Imagine managing this process without technology. So this is just kind of some fun math, and the fun math doesn't end in a very fun number. But if you look at a dealer that has 25,000 products, this particular example is 25,600 products on their shelf. To do a proper RAA analysis, you're going to need to consider at least 6 fields across the product shelf. Let's assume the firm has 150 advisors, like many of our clients do, in that range, each of whom is making 5 client recommendations per day. So that means every single day there are 100 million data points being analyzed in order to meet the same compliance standard as leveraging the technology in the previous slide. So, really that's a virtually impossible human task, and something that, I think requires a lot of consideration. So I think that kind of highlights, where we sit on the left side of that fulcrum, where, technology is definitely going to help balance out the meeting that key care obligation.
Thanks, David. Thanks for the example. So I want to take your example and say an advisor or an associated person uses technology to consider available alternatives. What are some best practices around communicating this recommendation to a client and then keeping track of that recommendation?
That's a great question. And I actually saw a couple of chat questions appear over the last few minutes that Matt and Pete were talking on this very subject. So, I think that the extent of client-facing documentation for reasonably available alternatives will ultimately be a risk decision for each wealth management firm. For example, we have a firm that plans to send an artifact of their reasonably available alternatives to the client with each recommendation. And so, there's a range of practices across our clients for sure. I think I think the key is that choosing to document this procedure is absolutely key. And whether or not the firm decides to share each recommendation with their clients will be their decision. Again, as noted earlier, this is a principles-based regulation, and so really there's interpretation that I think will be in the hands of each dealer as they implement. I think, as Pete suggested earlier, having a consistent practice around documentation is likely the best practice. And the 3 steps of documenting reasonably available alternatives, communicating and tracking these recommendations, are central to safeguarding the firm's reputation. I certainly believe, and I know Matt is a proponent of this as well, that technology is an absolute necessity to at least perform, the kind of calculations and identification of peer recommendations, and then demonstrating that those recommendations have been considered, and then ultimately choosing, if you wish, to communicate that to your clients in a consistent manner.
Thanks, David. As you heard today, part of what we've been hearing in today's conversation is that while some firms may be ready for the deadline, others still have some work to do and could use some help. This is why we will be offering today's attendees only with an opportunity to conduct a Reg BI health check. For this health check, we've partnered with seasoned industry expert Tom Selman, who's a former executive vice president of FINRA and founder of Scopus Financial Group, who will conduct a short 45-minute interview with your Reg BI team. We will then analyze the results internally, and within a week, deliver a Reg BI health check, which will help you, which will include a list of recommendations and that are customized to your unique firm. We'll be sure to follow up with you by way of email after today's session. This offer is only complimentary for the first 25 members who sign up. With that said, I'd like to transition to the Q&A session. Give me 1 second and I'll open up the questions. Okay, from Kathleen, advisory discretionary accounts. I keep hearing document alternatives. How do we do this when we decide to purchase an individual stock for a portfolio? I'll throw this up for anyone who'd like to take it.
Yeah, this is Matt here. I would say through our conversations, right? I mean, I think most of the, given the nature of the equity-based recommendations in that offered on brokerage platforms where the fee structure commission is, I'll say levelized right across the security that's bought. We haven't seen a lot of detailed analysis from a reasonably available alternative perspective focused on equities. It's been more focused on the mutual fund, I'll say the managed product universe in terms of mutual funds, ETF, closed-end funds. I do still think there's a requirement, right, to ensure that the sector, the size and style of that investment is appropriate for the portfolio. But I would just share that our conversations to date with firms that we've engaged with have really centered around the evaluation of mutual funds, ETFs, other managed products where I'll say the cost can vary quite significantly, across the the managed product type.
Thanks, Matt. Here's another good and tough question. There's been a lot of chatter, I guess, in the industry and articles written around the hold recommendation. Really, how do you document the hold recommendation that's being made? And I think, if I'm understanding the question correctly, every time that you're recommending an investor to hold a security, not buy or sell, you also have to prove some due diligence and documentation around that. So the question is, what are some best practices, I believe, around that?
Parham, it's Dave. I'm happy to kind of jump on that just from, we were chatting about reasonably available alternatives. So I think, given that a hold recommendation could occur, at a time when the reasonably available alternatives shift. And so, owning a particular product at, point A will have a certain set of reasonably available alternatives versus point B. And so I think any hold recommendation, any analysis that one might do, an advisor might do related to their client's portfolio that would result in a hold, really the reasonably available alternative exercise could be no different. That the example that we just provided earlier on that particular nationwide fund would generate a very different, potentially a different set of reasonably available alternatives. And so from a, compliance standpoint, I would say, with the abundance of caution, probably a good idea to be able to have that record of that analysis when you're making that recommendation.
Thanks, David. So I've got a question here for Peter. With the remote work environment pressures dialing up and examinations around the corner, what should a broker-dealer plan what should be their area of focus?
Well, one thing I think that, again, is how are you documenting what you're doing, particularly in a remote environment? Like if we're all under the same roof and close to each other, then theoretically we may have discussed something. But, what was looked at, it's going to have to be reviewed. Whoever's conducting the supervisory review is going to do it remotely. So what did he or she look at? And how did they look at it? So I think the remote environment almost makes any reason not to document this stuff less, because it's almost like you have to do your reviews. It's got to be documented so it can be seen remotely. So how are you doing that? I think, that's going to be, there's no reason not to do it because you've got to figure out a way to allow people who are remote who need to see it. So therefore, it's another incentive, I think, to document. And, technology's gotten cheaper over the years where storage space is a lot less than it used to be. So, holding on to key documents, things that were analyzed, I think particularly in a remote environment makes sense. So if it needs to be looked at remotely, why aren't you holding on to it? Would be the question I would ask if I was a regulator or a claimant's attorney years later trying to figure out what you did.
Yeah, and I would just echo, this is Matt here, echo Pete's comments around technology, just in terms of the amount of data, right? Each click, each point, each underlying assumption where we can capture that data, the reports themselves, as well as the other information around that session, all can be documented today, served up through, API or other data transmission capabilities. And so technology is definitely your friend as it relates to serving clients at a distance.
Thanks, Matt. I've got one more question for you here specifically. In your view, how will the different business models change as a result of Reg BI?
I think there's going to be a lot more, I'll say, engagement in the planning process, right? As we think about investors' profiles and what that means and how it's described in the regulation. So truly understanding, the objectives of the investor, their cash flow needs, other characteristics, right? That lends to an acceleration of the growth of planning and the number of households that have a documented financial plan. I think the use of advisory programs, right? So as the distance between best interest and fiduciary kind of shrinks that gap between what was suitability, I do think more representatives will consider advisory type relationships with their clients in order to, again, better serve and drive better outcomes. And so, I do think that, lead to deeper engagement. I think more investors will be more informed. They'll demand more from, right, the advisors or representatives that serve them. And I think planning, as well as the incorporation of third-party investment advisory or managed portfolio services, I think will definitely be an outcome of the regulation itself.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so I've got a somewhat unrelated question, but an important one given the deadline. It's related to Form CRS. Does the Form CRS need to be specific to each transaction, or are they intended to be general in scope and followed up with a discussion with the customer? Anyone want to tackle this?
This is Matt here. I will offer that, obviously you need to engage and consult with your own compliance team there. But in my experience, the Form CRSs that I've seen developed and are expected to be delivered through our technology are standard documents that create a description of the transactions and fee model or cost of service model. Those again are, I'll say, general in nature, specific to the firm, but general in nature, and followed on by a specific conversation with the investor. But as always, make sure you consult your internal compliance team as well in terms of their objectives around Form CRS.
Parham, it's Dave. What I would add to that is completely agree with Matt's comments. And I think rather than the Form CRS being customized at the transaction level, it's more, will change over time as, elements of Form CRS and elements of disclosure on that document evolve over time. So, it's a living and breathing document, but it will not change at the recommendation level.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, David. So there's a few more questions. Bear with me. This is a good one. So what is the duty of the firm to expand its list of products on the, quote, shelf to include potential additional reasonably available alternatives? It's a couple parts to the question, but I'll leave it at that, and then I'll ask additional questions related to this. Does anyone know if there's a duty on the firm here?
In terms of the product shelf, right, and I think there's definitely varying school of thoughts around just the complete open architecture and then leaving it again to the representative to using capabilities that are supported by the firm to evaluate based on performance, risk, and cost. But I will say, from a Morningstar perspective, we have had a significant amount of engagement in terms of reviewing the product shelf to make sure that the ingredients themselves, right, it's striking the right balance between, as the question, the individual that posed the question rightly points out, you need to make sure that the product shelf is big enough, right, to support the needs of the investor base that you're serving. But at the same time, you can, in fact, help in that process of evaluating reasonably available alternatives by paring down that product shelf to create, again, more best-in-class offerings. I would just say this. There are plenty of investment products, per asset class, per category, per prospectus objective or subcategory, where you can actually, again, engage in due diligence and selection of a product shelf that, again, pares down from the broader universe, but still offers plenty of offerings. I don't think there's an actual mandate to do so. However, again, you can go a long way in the process by working to make sure that your representative base are starting with a great pool of ingredients, right, that are aligned around performance, risk, and cost.
And this is Pete. I think what Matt says makes a lot of sense. And the SEC has said in their release that Reg BI does not require an evaluation of every possible alternative. So you don't have to have the entire universe, but are you looking at it enough? And it also doesn't require that the recommendation be, quote, the best alternative. But you have to, there has to be reasonable available alternatives. So you're not going to have to look at what's in the whole world, and it doesn't have to be the best, but there's got to be a reasonable process and basis.
I think, Parham, the other thing I would add that, there's actually a risk with a lot of the KYP regulatory movement, I'd say even outside of the United States, sort of broadly, that product shelves could actually shrink. I mean, some kind of dealers view that, for us to be expected to meet a higher KYP standard, which is really what the care obligation is all about, what we're going to do is shrink our shelves. And, again, whether that ultimately serves the investor, that's probably an unintended consequence of the regulators, or whether it meets kind of the architectural, sort of plan of the dealer and the promise to the advisors as well. So, I think regardless of shelf size, technology is going to be required to perform a proper KYP function, such as reasonably available alternatives. And, while there isn't an obligation to expand the shelf, I think the regulators hope that there are solutions that are put in place so that shelf isn't reduced, and ultimately choice to the investor is not limited.
Thanks, David. So we've got a couple more minutes and a few more questions. So if anybody has any last minute questions, please submit them. So we've got a question again on Form CRS. If a client is delivered a Form CRS at account opening and then decides to add additional funds to the account at a later date, would the act of injecting additional funds trigger a recommendation and an additional Form CRS delivery? Questions are getting more complex as we're getting through this.
I think, as it's Dave, I think as we mentioned earlier, if between that kind of point A and point B, something material has changed in the content of a Form CRS, then absolutely it has to be delivered. So kind of, I think one way to think of Form CRS is a versioned document, and what creates, version 2 from version 1 is a significant change that requires disclosure to the client. That probably is not a transaction. But I would say if between those two investment events, the Form CRS has changed, then absolutely it needs to be redelivered. So, this will be a kind of an organic process around keeping your investors current on aspects of Form CRS that are changing. And importantly, it will require you as a dealer to ensure that you can report on the delivery to specific investors of specific versions of Form CRS.
Thanks, David. Matt, maybe one more question. I know we got to jump off in a minute. In your review, will there be a big shift in the product marketplace as a result of Reg BI?
Yeah, I do think that, if you think about the secular trends in the managed product space, we are seeing, a predominance of the assets going to lower cost investment options. And so that has been happening, right? And so I do think, I would consider Reg BI to be an accelerant in that trend in terms of, on a category by category basis, a strong focus on reducing the cost to that end investor. And so I just think, again, it's an accelerant of that secular trend around developing and delivering lower cost investment products, still meeting the category needs across the multi-asset spectrum, but I do think from a product development perspective, that's really where you're going to see a lot of focus is on, making sure, again, that that costs are minimized.
Thank you, Matt, Pete, and David for your comments today, and thank you all for attending. We very much enjoyed this conversation, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Please let us know if you have any feedback via our survey, which will be followed after today's session. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.